So there was an issue that I has kind of come up in the last year in American democracy, but also like in other democracies. And I'm kind of on a kick for, democracy dying. So let's hit another one of those. So let's talk about political polarization and violence. So let's start with political polarization. So first of all, what is political polarization? Effectively, political polarization is when a party or a political leader or some other group or individual who has some involvement in some involvement in politics, uses their influence to create a particularly fractious division. Think of this as being something that might divide individuals over their core beliefs, an opinion that is not likely to be changed. One of these might be like a religious belief, for example. Oftentimes, religious beliefs are great things to use. Culture war issues are also kind of good for this. And essentially, as you find these niche issues as a politically savvy individual, you can use them to gain power across a wide base of individuals, provided the opinion is popular enough. So if you are staking out your claim with a position that is fairly popular or that a significant voting bloc will vote for, regardless of their other interests, by the way, culture war issues, right? A lot of these things, then you can essentially leverage that for your political game. But it's not really just enough to do that once or twice, because eventually, if they elect you enough times, then they might get concerned when you don't actually solve the problem that you claim is such a big deal, right? So if you claim the government is infringing on your, religious right to, I don't know, make something up, and you get enough people to vote you into office, and then you can't change it, or you don't change it because you actually don't care about it, you just use it as a stepping stool to power, then the people who you polarized may start, or radicalized, may start to depolarize or de-radicalize, because you can't keep them whipped up in a fervor anymore. And by the way, this strategy typically comes up when you don't have anything substantive to offer, or you can't offer anything substantive to the individuals, either because things are too good, or because things are too bad, or because you're corrupt or bought out or sold out or whatever. So as you continue down this road, you have to find other of these niche issues to grab onto with hopefully similar bases in the political electorate. However, you can also use, information and misinformation to actually make some of these issues more salient than they would be otherwise. But I don't really want to give a crash course on that because I think that's bad. Anyway, as you continue to accrue more and more of these hardcore core beliefs that you are claiming that you can change or that the other side is imposing on you, you make politics more and more a zero-sum game. And what that means is, in layman's terms, is that you make politics, you drive up the stakes of each individual election. So if you believe, honestly and truly, that something that you value in your core, and that you and lots of people value in your core, is going to be either taken away from you, or the opposite version is going to be imposed on you if you lose an election, then if you lose the election, you might think that, well, democracy is actually not the answer. You may think that you have to defend your core value outside of the ballot box, because essentially what's happened is you've been told, and you believe at this point, that lots of these things you consider core issues to you are going to be done the other way, or done the wrong way, by this, evil group, or this bad group that has come to power through the ballot box. You might start to believe that the ballot box is actually not the place for you, and that the institution of democracy is not good for you. And then the next logical response is, well, if I cannot achieve my ends peacefully, and by the way, peaceful could mean protest too, right? You're not just the ballot box, right? You could protest, you say, hey, if you protest in the street, you could say, hey, I actually don't think that we should be doing things this way, and you can protest, and you can make your voices heard, and you can talk to your representatives even if you don't like them, right? You can still participate in the process peacefully without using violence. But in the event that fails, or you don't believe that will work from the get-go because this is a core belief of yours in theory, right? Then violence becomes seemingly the next most appropriate answer. And political polarization doesn't always have to lead to violence, especially if the polarization can be resolved, or if there can be some other situation that comes about where people can be depolarized. However, in the event that polarization goes on for a long enough period of time, or enough issues are stacked into the polarization such that individuals are confident that they cannot get back whatever it is they're losing at the ballot box, then violence becomes inevitable. Because people essentially, remember, politics is important to our lives, not just because it has the opportunity to shape the way that we live and do things, but because oftentimes that's the only way that major amounts of things in society can be changed, right? And many people's only interaction with national life is through their participation in government, right? And that's not surprising. Oftentimes that's the way it's set up to be. But because it's so serious, and by the way, every election has a significant amount of stakes in it, then your reaction might logically be that if you are not able to achieve your political ends by peaceful and electoral means, then the peaceful and electoral processes should not be relied upon, right? And so I talked about this in another segment that I did this week, but essentially, you know, political polarization can lead to sectarianism, and sectarianism is kind of this radical separation between groups, and it almost feels tribal is not a great word, but it is the word that we have. It feels tribal, right? It feels like there's an us and a them, and as that division becomes more and more pronounced, it doesn't really matter what's going on at the ballot box because you will always feel threatened. And when you feel threatened, you feel react, right? And that reaction will often come in the form of violence. So these things are inextricably linked, even if they're not always the case, right? There are outs. There are ways to get away from the political polarization train that leads to violence, right? There are stops along that train. But because it is oftentimes in the interest of politicians to keep stoking that fire over and over again to win elections, to win votes, the incentives of the politicians is to actually not depoliticize, not depolarize, not de-radicalize, but to actually keep polarizing and keep radicalizing, because it gets them votes, which gets them power, which gets them money, which gets them, fame and fortune and book deals and whatever it's going to be, right? So the incentive structure, unfortunately, is that once political polarization has started in earnest, it will almost always lead to violence. And that's problematic for a number of reasons, but it also undermines democracy at its core level. Democracy is about the peaceful transfer of power, and if you resort to violence, you no longer have that. But also, it's entirely possible that people who have actual power, even if that power is not derivative from political means, that they can use their power and influence as to create polarization and create violence to overthrow democracies. So essentially, the crux of this is, and it's just kind of relying on the argument I made earlier about how fragile democracies are, is that when we see political polarization in our national life and our national politics, we have to find a way to either fact check what's going on or to make sure that we can help be part of the de-radicalization process. And also, by the way, recognize when we are being radicalized. When the people you're listening to are telling you that another group are doing these terrible things and someone's got to do something about it, right? That's stochastic terrorism. That is a sign that you are being radicalized. We have it in us to prevent this. We have it in us to prevent polarization from leading to violence. It is okay to be polarized on some issues. Politics is a big deal, and oftentimes the most significant changes in our society are made through the ballot box. So it's okay to be upset. It's okay to argue about politics. I'm a socialist. Many of you watching probably don't agree with that. That's fine. But if we believe that there are either evil characters out there or that our core beliefs are being violated and we don't have a way to rectify the thing that we see as wrong, we are being radicalized and conditioned to turn to violence. And we have the power to stop the train, to get off the train of radicalization, of polarization before it gets to violence. So, yes, it is incumbent on our political leaders to be responsible with the way that they wield political power and influence, but at the same time, in some ways, it is also the responsibility of the people and workers and us, regular, individuals, to organize ourselves, to de-radicalize ourselves, to put ourselves in a position where we cannot be taken advantage of for someone else's power. Because, let me just, one last thing here. If there is a violent uprising and you are involved in it, and the state or the military doesn't agree with you, essentially, if you have a violent uprising that doesn't result in a coup, and there's no one in power who's actually helping you take over the government with your violent movement, the people who radicalized you, they're not going to be standing shoulder to shoulder to you as the police and military brutally beat you or kill you. They're not going to be there. They're going to be in their ivory towers, in their mansions, in their places of power, because they used you. You were a sucker. And you believed things that weren't true or were exaggerated. And it's never going to be the case that the people who are radicalizing you are going to actually be doing the fighting with you. They'll benefit if you win, don't get me wrong. And you might even benefit if you win, but it's much less likely. But if you turn against the state, one of the things that states do, democratic or otherwise, is perpetuate themselves, right? So if there's a threat, even a domestic threat about to the state is going to use its power to remain a state, to do the thing that states do, which is continue to exist. And if they think that you are a real danger to them, to the continued existence of the state, then the state will fuck your day up. So don't be used, right? Make sure to de-radicalize, depoliticize. Don't demobilize, because mobilization is how we enact change through our legislative process, through our representative process. So never demobilize, but de-radicalize, depolarize. Every conflict that we have with our political opponents can be fought in a war of words. Even if we don't convince them, we can still use words and positive actions and peaceful actions to show our political desires. Violence is never the answer, because it never leads to a positive outcome. And if we encourage violence, then violence can be encouraged against us. And if you are not the strongest side, but you encourage violence, then violence is committed upon you by a more prominent faction. There is no going back. There is no saying, "Oh, I didn't mean it," or "I only meant the violence was good if my side did it." It's not how it works. Once you encourage violence, once you allow violence to become part of the political process, democracy is done. Your voice doesn't matter. Unless you're the one with the gun or at the top of the political power chain there, it doesn't matter. So don't do it. We all have the power to prevent political violence. And I think we all should take the time to make sure that we do that.